Okay. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Kids in Mind, a seminar series aimed at families to provide support and practical strategies to help kids and their parents through this pandemic. So today's seminar series is our first one actually that we've invited people from outside the university. I'm absolutely thrilled and also feel quite indebted to both Tracy Considine and Hugh Miller for being brave and coming on to today's seminar series to provide practical strategies for families when thinking about homeschooling during the pandemic, but also thinking about kids going back to school and what are things families can do now to think about how to do that in a way which supports kids and families. Our seminar series has been very popular. We've had some great academics talk about issues that are important to parents. We had Phil Britton talk about kids and COVID, Nicholas Wood talk about vaccines and youth, Nat Munro and Rebecca Sutherland on Monday gave a great seminar series on language development and children for homeschooling. I trust that you can go back and watch those seminar series on YouTube if you want any information about those topics. Today's topic is, however, focused on schools. It's not the Department of Education. We're not proposing to change the public health strategy around schools and the opening of schools for children, but we are proposing to provide practical strategies for things that might help kids in the current pandemic and in the future. Welcome, Tracy and Hugh.
Hi, Adam. Nice to join you tonight.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks very much. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you. And one of the things that I didn't realise until discussing with you earlier is that schools have played a really incredible role in supporting the community. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The first part of this seminar series, we're going to talk about the impact of COVID and the indirect effects of COVID on families. The second part, we'll be talking about the role that schools have had to play beyond teaching, really. And then the third part will be about transitions and how to support kids when thinking about going back to school when that happens. So maybe, Hugh, I'll start with you and just ask you about the impact of COVID and homeschooling on children and learning more directly, but then some of the indirect effects you've noticed as school principal of Stanmore Public.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Well, thanks so much for having me this evening. Great to join you and Tracy. Look, I think there's no doubt that the impact of the pandemic on schooling has been profound. You know, we've had to fundamentally change the way that we've operated for hundreds of years in a very short space of time. It's been a little bit easier this time because we had a bit of practice in 2020, but it still has been a huge upending of everything that everybody knows about schools, hasn't it? You know, that's from school leaders, teachers, parents, kids, you know, all levels of the school community. And there's no doubt, you know, that the pandemic has had really significant impacts on many kids' well-being. But I guess one of the key messages that I want to get out to parents is that in terms of their learning, the kids will be all right. You know, I think that it's really helps to think of the time that we've spent out of the school as a loss of schooling, rather than the phrase which you often read in the press, which is a loss of learning. Kids are still learning. You know, our teachers have been working incredibly hard, sending out learning from home plans. And while we do acknowledge that there's varying levels of capacity that families and kids have to engage with those, you know, kids have not only been engaging in their academic learning, but they've learned to do a whole other range of skills and knowledges and understanding through this time. Their abilities with technology have rocketed. Their innovation and their adaptability and their resilience has been something that we've seen come through really strongly. And you know, an old supervisor of mine many years ago told me that teaching and education is waves on a beach. So there's going to be plenty of opportunities for kids to catch up on anything that they might have missed over this period of time. And our teachers are real experts in differentiating the curriculum to meet the needs of learners at their point of need. So when the kids come back into school, that's what we'll do.
So Hugh, what are some of the indicators to you that suggest that as a whole, as a larger group, kids are generally doing okay, even when they go into lockdown?
Well, we've just had a look as an education sector at the 2020 NAPLAN results, both at school level and across the state, and they have indicated that it's pretty much business as usual in terms of our NAPLAN results. So that's a really good takeaway, that even though we had a very disrupted year last year, there hasn't shown up in the NAPLAN results or the check-in assessments to be a really significant system-wide impact on academic outcomes. And that corroborates some of the data that's beginning to come out of the UK and the US and Europe, where it's really showing that across whole systems, learning hasn't been disrupted as much as you might initially think.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the themes of this series has been the different types of learning. And when I think about learning traditionally, I might be thinking about English or maths or science. And a lot of the countries where they've had much stronger lockdowns, much harsher, I should say, the data seems to suggest, at least the early data, that there hasn't been a huge impact in that space for the whole community. But when we look at the data currently, it seems to be language and socialization, that social skills, which we'll talk a bit about later, that where some of the concern might be. But
there's no doubt it's impossible to replicate a playground environment or an interactive classroom environment via Zoom or via remote learning packs. Yeah,
okay, great. Tracy, look, I am really interested because you've been at sort of, sorry to use a normal word, but at the coalface of the pandemic in Canterbury, in an area that has been in lockdown and experienced the lockdown in a somewhat different way to other parts of Sydney. I was wondering if you might be able to talk to some of the impacts you've seen for families and the school community at Canterbury Public School.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. We are in the thick of it in the Canterbury Bankstown LGA, and we've seen the direct impacts of COVID with families bringing COVID home from workplaces. And of course, it's highly infectious and can often spread through the whole family. And the impacts of that. So, the loss of income, illness, family members taken to hospital, separation, isolation within homes. And I guess the school has worked very hard to support those families, and we've come together very much as a community. We're a very strong community at the best of times, but being able to come together and support those families and give them what they need. And so for those families, it wasn't a continuity of education that became the priority of lockdown and learning from home, but actually making sure that there was still food on the table to feed families, and they were getting the help and support and links to the supports and services that they needed.
So in some ways, you're suggesting the school has had to play a role in providing basic social services.
Absolutely. Look, schools are increasingly becoming the hub of the community, and we understand that teaching is our core business, but that's only just part of our role in this day and age, particularly during a pandemic where we've got, for example, at our school, and we're not alone, 64% of our families speak a language other than English. We have a full spectrum of socioeconomic backgrounds, from extremely poor at the best of times to our quite middle class inner Westies and everything in between. And so it very much became apparent that our priority was on wellbeing and connecting families to each other, to teachers, but also to external services to support their essential needs at the time. And that's ongoing.
I mean, this sounds like an enormous challenge, Tracy. What are there any sort of, to give the listeners some examples of some of the challenges your families face? You've already mentioned food security is a basic issue. What are the other challenges that some of your families are facing?
We have a support unit in our school. So we have students who come from mostly southwestern Sydney and enrol at our school in a support unit class. They have a diagnosis of autism spectrum or a moderate intellectual disability. So we work very hard at best of times to keep those families connected to our school. But obviously the safety aspect became a big priority too, about looking after those very vulnerable students and their families, as well as taking care of students with a disability and keeping them connected to their teachers and to their school and their families to each other. We, as I said, we've got a lot of families who work night and day to put food on the table, who then found themselves out of work as an indirect result of the pandemic and the lockdown, or directly because of the lockdown. And so, as I said, it became very important for us to keep everyone vertical and upright. So when learning from home, when we came out of the initial holidays and into learning from home, it was about, okay, we maintain our purpose, and this is every school. What's our purpose? Our purpose is student safety, learning and wellbeing. And how do we do that while we're all working from home and learning from home? And our purpose was really to keep everybody upright, our hardworking teachers and non-teaching staff who were transforming the way they work, as well as families working from home or not working from home, and the students. So at worst, keeping them upright, but at best, hopefully thriving as a result of the support that we could offer. But, we're not alone. That's how every school I know operates.
Yeah. Tracy, and Hugh as well, on a daily basis, I suspect you're facing new, diverse challenges. Do you mind me asking how you cope with that on a daily basis? How do you wake up each day and go, what's going to happen today with these various challenges you face?
We've had a lot of training, haven't we, Hugh?
Yeah,
before the pandemic.
I think that's one of the great parts about the job. It's never dull, and no 2 days are exactly the same. And I think, just as Tracy said, then I think as long as you've got that moral purpose and the school's vision, of putting the kids first and making sure that we're looking out for kids' well-being and learning as our first and foremost consideration, and making sure that we're supporting our staff. And particularly from learning from home, supporting our parents to do that as best we can, then it all flows from there. I know that myself and my team and all the other schools I know have been really strong in encouraging parents, to prioritise their kids' well-being and to do what they can, because we know that we're all in the same storm, but we're in very different boats, as Tracy so beautifully illustrated. There are families who are doing it really, really tough. There are kids who might be really, really thriving in lockdown. So I think it's always being open to listen if people have concerns or questions, whether that's kids, whether that's staff, or whether that's parents, and working with people to help them to maybe tweak their routines or the expectations, just so that it stays manageable. Yeah,
and I imagine a lot of this takes a lot more than tweaking from your end. What are some of the things that you've done or the school's done to sort of support families, different types of strategies you've put in place?
We've loaned out a lot of technology. We've maintained a really proactive approach through our teachers to connecting with kids and with parents, particularly if we might see engagement dropping off, or motivation might be waning a little bit. I think that's something we learned from last time. Some feedback that we got was that there were some families who maybe didn't feel like we were maybe quite proactive enough in staying in touch. So that's something we've tried really hard to do. And I think just consistently putting out that message that kids can't learn in a high stress environment. You know, if you've got a lot of cortisol building up in those neural pathways, that's not going to be optimal space for learning. So, you know, if it means taking a wellbeing day, if it means taking a few wellbeing days, if it means, you know, modifying the program so that the work gets done early in the morning, you know, or any of those kinds of things, I think having that flexibility, but also really maintaining that contact and communication has been really important.
Yeah, actually, when you look at the literature and the diversity of responses during COVID, it looks like it's the kids that have the greatest number of vulnerabilities that probably, I mean, I'm probably not being Einstein here, but they're struggling the most. Tracy, you know, I imagine the community has become quite important for your school. Could you maybe speak to some of the strategies your school has had to engage with the community to get that the needed support for families?
Yeah, absolutely, Adam. Hugh nailed it with making sure that every family has the technology they need. And for some of our families, that included internet. Some didn't have internet, so learning from home was never going to work. And it was really initially about removing any barrier to continuity of education and keeping people connected. So we continued with a lot of our programs that we had in place, as did all schools and as have all schools, running P&C meetings. We were very fortunate to, at the beginning of the year, set every class up, and it was quite fortuitous timing, set every class up with social connection groups where a parent would take the lead and connect with other members of the class. And so it helped to really fast forward a lot of relationships and bonds between students as well as their parents. And I think that has helped to keep a lot of our families going too, who would have been quite disconnected otherwise. And we've continued to do that, linking families up when students or parents are starting to feel quite isolated and lonely. And of course, having lots of fun days and things during this, really trying to find the fun and the positive side of learning from home. So running a Father's Day trivia night or having book week. And I know that was much to some families' chagrin, having to still do the book parade in lockdown. But we have never seen such high levels of engagement. And we saw that, you know, if we wanted to keep kids engaged, we had to break the monotony of just staying at home every single day. And, you know, the continuity of our educational intervention programs as well for students needing a lot more support, and running our learning support team and making sure that we continue to talk about students and link those families with different services and therapies and so on. So there's lots of different ways that every school has worked within their own school context to keep families as connected as possible, and that continuous comms of saying, please reach out to us, we're here for you, anything you need. If we can't help you, we know who we can find people who can, and reinforcing that at every opportunity.
Yeah, there's no doubt the school in the current pandemic has become the community hub, much like a GP is the health hub for the needs of the family. And so just thinking about what could be done if you're a family or adults wanting to support schools, how do you recommend families engage with schools to support the community?
Well, I think that, sorry, I've just seen one of my kids walking in the door behind me, classic COVID issue. So look, I think, you know, just as Tracy said, you know, getting in touch with those class parents, getting involved with the P&C. I mean, the P&C is not for everyone, but just, you know, making those connections through the school. Obviously, we don't have the playground or the back gate at the moment. So I think it's really great when we've got those things like class parents who can send messages out to families and link kids up. And also we're so lucky to have the technology at the moment.
Yeah.
That's allowing kids to stay in touch.
And I think utilising, so our non-teaching staff, so our learning support officers, who are usually sitting shoulder to shoulder with students with additional needs, their whole work transformed, and suddenly they had to be tech gurus and in breakout rooms supporting small groups, but also they were making a lot of calls on behalf of the school to families where we saw that absence was increasing, or we were concerned about engagement or how the child's wellbeing when we saw them through Zoom classes. So just utilising all the resources that we could, and just transforming the whole way we operated. But that was evolving. That, you know, we continue to get feedback, all schools get feedback from the community and try and do better.
Yeah. Okay. Now we are going to move to the transition phase of our discussion. And I didn't mention at the start, but we have a chat function on the Zoom. And if you have any questions, you can post it to the chat. We can see it as panelists, but no one else can see it. So you don't have to be worried about other people judging your comment, and we'll try and answer them as best as we can. So talking about going back to school, I mean, it's on every family's discussion around what are they going to do, how are they going to manage it? And, you know, there's different needs for different kids. Hugh, what are your thoughts about managing transitions, and what are the considerations, you know, you think parents should be thinking about now?
I think there's no doubt that it is going to be really challenging for a lot of kids. I think we learned last time that there was a little bit of a rush of euphoria, an initial excitement. It felt like the first day of school and everyone was so thrilled to be back. But then fairly quickly, we realized that a lot of kids had to really relearn how to be at school. And this learning from home period has been somewhat longer. So I think that we will need to really put some, you know, I'm sure that, you know, there's staff, school staffs and school leadership teams across the city and the state who right now are planning some really explicit strategies to help kids settle back into those routines. You know, even just simple things we take for granted, like taking turns in class, following school routines in terms of bell times, interacting with large groups of their peers, having been at home for extended periods of time. That's going to be challenging for a lot of kids.
Yeah, you mentioned that euphoria, and when you mentioned it, I did a bit of survey on my kids, I have to say, because I thought I've got to get some, you know, community participation from the kids. And so I asked both of them about how they feel about coming to school. And you'll be pleased to know that at least one of them doesn't mind coming back to school. But what he commented to me was about he's so excited to see his friends, and he wanted to actually show off about how good he is getting at a particular computer game. We won't get there. But I wondered about how long that euphoria lasts and what your experience was of COVID last time, and what parents should be prepared for, even if their kids are looking forward to going back to school.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think for every child, it's going to be different because, you know, as you said, some kids are just champing at the bit and cannot wait to get back. And there might be some kids for whom learning from home is working really well, and they might be feeling quite a bit of anxiety about going back into that setting. And, you know, there's obviously concerns about the virus as well. Yeah. So, look, I would really be recommending parents to start talking early. Start talking to your kids about how they're feeling. Start, you know, reminding them about, you know, the change of routines, planning for things like reprogramming kids' sleep patterns, for example, and probably not booking too much up in the way of, you know, social activities and after-school activities and weekend activities, even though it's going to be great with things opening back up and we can all go see grandparents and everything again, and that's really important. I think being ready for the fact that it's going to be very exhausting for the kids to be back doing full days at school after living fairly quiet lives for a long period of time. But yeah, I think having those discussions to sort of help them prepare psychologically. So, you know, it might be a little bit of a role play. It might be, you know, just creating those spaces where kids feel comfortable to talk. So it's not always sit down at the dining table and let's talk about our feelings, but maybe it's while you're having a walk or playing a game or, you know, doing some cooking that, you know, those things might just sort of come out a bit more naturally.
I remember in the previous discussion, you sort of indicated that you saw this crash after the first week. Some kids came in all excited and pumped about being at school, and, you know, they wanted to play sport and they wanted to do, you know, whatever instrument they wanted to play at school. What did you notice after that first week?
Well, look, I think as well, we have to remember that last time, but also even more so this time, school's going to look quite different to what kids have been used to. So you mentioned sport, for example. You know, our kids who live and die for those PWSA competitions and the athletics carnival, those things aren't going to be happening this year. Our high performance, drama and music kids, those events and those ensembles aren't happening at the moment either. The Department of Education is giving us quite specific instructions about how schools are going to be run, and there's going to be depending on the specific school context, schools might be having staggered break times, they might be having staggered start and finish times, they might be allocating areas of the playground to different cohorts, they might have staffing changes, to minimise the number of people who are working with groups of kids. So although they'll be back, they might still be grieving for some things that they've lost. So I think that's part of that, I guess, the initial euphoria followed by possibly the reality that it's not maybe exactly what everyone had hoped for is something that I think families need to be ready for.
Right. And did you see that sort of after that first week, did you see any changes in the playground?
Yes, definitely. You got to think that they're going from a situation where they've just been with their immediate family and maybe, a few neighbours or bumping into a few people at the park to being with, hundreds of other peers in a playground setting. And particularly maybe for some of our neurodiverse kids or some kids maybe who in terms of their social development need a little bit more support, that's challenging. So we'll continue to have that really strong focus on well-being and supporting kids in their social development when they return.
Tracy, do you have any suggestions for kids that, for example, my other son, his report was there was a few things he didn't like about school, and he's been worrying about it ever since. And it's almost like it's built up in his mind more and more because he hasn't been at school, he hasn't been exposed to the environment. It's almost like he's got more anxiety about going to school now than what he did, a few months ago. So I'm just wondering, do you have any suggestions for families in that situation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm sorry he's feeling that way, Adam.
I might be exaggerating a little bit, but it's okay.
Well, I have a son who is living his best life at home. Let's just say learning from home has been the best thing to ever happen to him. The time he's been at school. And so, there are going to be a lot of adjustments. For my son, the opposite is, normally he is a worrier. He is a what if. So my conversation is going to be a little bit different. But my advice to you and to all parents is the same. What are your concerns? What are your child's concerns? Communicate them with the school. Give the teachers, some space these holidays, but then when school returns, start having those conversations, initiate the call or the email and just say, look, we've been starting to have conversations about returning to school. Here's what he's excited about. Here's what she's concerned about. Here are my concerns. And that allows us as a school to start preparing while we're still learning from home, thinking about integrating some of those conversations into our programs during learning from home, focusing a lot on the social and emotional and communication skills that, as Hugh said so eloquently, they haven't really practiced, or they've been practicing very different ways to resolve conflict at home that hopefully looks different in the playground and in the classroom. So if we're prepared for your child's return, then we're going to make that transition a lot easier for them. And it starts with conversations at home and then continuing those conversations with the school.
And you'd be doing that now, is that right?
Absolutely. And just like you did, I, starting to talk to my son and pick your battles as well. You just have the conversations when they're ready to talk, or if you're in the car, they're a captive audience. And just get a sense of how they're feeling and what their actual concerns are, because schools can do a lot of guesswork, but it's obviously more meaningful and authentic if we're addressing the problems and the ladder's up the right wall by the time the kids come back.
Yeah, we'll be having a discussion around anxiety and COVID in kids, specifically fear around COVID. We'll be having a webinar about that later. But I guess from a psychology perspective, one might think that listening to kids is really important, and identifying exactly what the fear is and possibly the threat, and then really trying to, as an adult, help kids to work through those worries. A lot of those worries, there'll probably be things that aren't necessarily realistic, and and giving kids a sense of control is really important. So what can they do if there is a possible danger?
That's right. Asking them, what solutions do you have? You know, what are your concerns? What solutions do you suggest? And, you know, giving them voice and agency.
And just around the COVID issue, because it's coming up in the chat quite a lot, what are the sort of strategies that we can start to think about talking about with kids that schools will be implementing if they are worrying about COVID? Because I think, you know, children do need to feel like they have some control over this, and there's all sorts of fears about the virus at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, as I mentioned before, the Department of Education is giving public schools fairly specific instructions on how the school will operate when we do start the staggered return. And that involves setting up discrete cohorts of kids, you know, who will kind of mix in those bubbles, if you will. And so looking at separating out, as I said, break time, separating out playground areas, possibly timing access to toilets. So that's minimising the number of kids who are coming into contact with each other. They're only going to be learning within their single classroom, so they won't be going off to the library and the music room and the learning support room. They'll be doing all of their education in one space, and there'll probably be a limited number of staff members who will come into that space. We're strongly recommending that primary school students wear masks. It's not mandatory, and obviously that's got to be up to families. So, and you know, we'll be continuing to talk about hand hygiene and really having those frank and honest conversations with parents if kids do come to school with even the slightest of cold symptoms, and the same with staff as well. Okay,
we've got a question from Liz, and I know this is a bit of a fortune-telling moment because things can change very rapidly, and the advice from the Department of Education can also change rapidly depending on what LGA you're in and what is the situation of the day. But what are the sorts of things that schools will do in the first week and days of return to school?
I think, and this might disappoint some of our viewers, but I think keeping it very light and positive, and giving children lots of time to spend together with friends. We're not going to be doing death by assessment from day one, and our programs are in place. We will continue. So as students move from learning from home to learning at school, the continuity of those learning and teaching programs will continue. However, we are obviously going to meet the children where they are. So using the work samples that students have been submitting during the their last 15 weeks of learning from home, as well as through formative assessment during lesson times at school, and getting a sense of, okay, are there gaps? Where are the gaps? Let's focus. What are the trends? What do we need to revisit? Where can we move on?
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to do what we have always done, and that is, you know, start with what we know about the students, and that's, you know, that informs our practice and our focus.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd echo that too. I mean, look, obviously we're going to be focusing on those core curriculum areas of English and maths. We're really aware that that's our core business. But I think another thing that we learnt last year is that without all the excursions and the concert days and the sport days and, you know, the things that kind of lift school spirit and give that oxygen to a school environment, that if it's just teaching and learning day in and day out, academics, it can become a real grind. So I think, like Tracy said, really consciously programming in some fun, obviously within the public health orders and the department's guidelines, but making sure there's that chance for fun, for focus on well-being, and for re-establishing those social connections, which, as we were started off saying, is what the kids have most missed out on.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Hugh. Now we've got a question from Beck. I assume this is a resounding yes. Are you expecting a lot of parents to be anxious about sending their children back to school for fear of contracting COVID?
Of course, I think a healthy level of concern is fine, but I know in my home I'm very mindful of the conversations I have with my children and away from my children. So we have to be careful that we're not passing on our own anxieties to children who would otherwise be quite fine and looking forward to returning to school. So I'd be keeping those conversations positive at home, and trust us as parents always have. Trust that schools don't want children getting sick. Schools want kids well. We want to stay well as well. So we're going to do everything we can to keep everybody safe. That's our priority.
Yeah. Okay. Now, how can we? This is from Daniel. How can we help prepare our children? What would be helpful to say?
I think you summed it up really nicely before, Adam. I don't think it's so much about what parents say. It's more about creating that space to listen to what kids have to say. And I put my hand up for that as a parent. I'm always trying to solve my kids' problems and always trying to propose solutions. And, I'm really trying to, as a parent, practice what I preach and take that emotion coaching approach, where sometimes it is about listening. It's about showing sympathy. And then, as Tracy mentioned before, asking the kids, well, what do you think would be, how could we deal with this? How could I help you? How could your teacher help you? And so, it's hard to sort of say what one conversation will be, because it's going to be a very different conversation for one child who has desperately missed their friends and is so excited and can't wait, to perhaps another child who's feeling a bit more anxious and a bit more tentative about going back to school. And probably a lot of kids are going to have a mixture of those feelings about different parts of school.
Yeah, and actually, look, there's another question here that is really about separation anxiety and how to manage separation anxiety in kids. And to be absolutely honest, I think anxiety across the board is going to be very high in a lot of children transitioning back to school. It's part of the reality that kids have been around their families for a very long time, and venturing out into the world has been associated with danger. So I think listening to kids is right, but then, as I said earlier, really identifying the thoughts that are about danger and lack of safety, and then trying to give kids practical strategies to manage that danger. One of the things we do as psychologists is work a lot on building confidence. So, for example, if kids are worried about venturing out, then trying to do strategies leaving the house gradually and building up the amount of time, not in a way to throw kids into it and to just, sink or swim, but as a way to gradually build their confidence that actually this is something I can do and succeed in, and I'm okay. And there's a whole range of fears around that, whether they feel they're able to do it themselves or whether there's danger in the community. And there's by listening to kids, you're going to be able to pull that apart. But what I would suggest, just because they've asked specifically to answer it, is making sure it's gradual and takes into the account the real fears of kids, which are, I think, really quite understandable at the moment, and doing it in a gentle way. If the kids, for example, sleeping in parents' beds is very common, and if that wasn't something that was happening beforehand, starting to think about how you can go back to a normal routine gradually. So, making sure they are starting to go back to their bed and supporting them through that process gradually would be some of the things that. But if you are concerned, I'd strongly suggest seeing your GP and trying to book in to see a psychologist. And I think we're going to be inundated with families during this time, and that's okay because we need to support the community at the moment.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, sorry. Can anyone add anything to that?
Yep, you nailed it.
Thank you. Now we've also put in the link for the Department of the advice for families about level 3+ schools. That's actually the link you provided us. Hugh, can you tell the listeners about that link and what they can, how they can use that link?
Well, yeah, that link is the advice for families about level 3+ schools. So that's the terminology for the I guess the operations for when we start the staggered return to school. So that's got a more detailed information for those I guess measures which I was talking about before, you know, the cohorts and the staggered times and all of the hygiene and ventilation measures that they're putting in place and those sorts of things.
Yeah. There's a question about wellbeing programs, and look, I'm happy to address some of those wellbeing programs in our anxiety seminar. We're going to do that in quite a lot of detail, but you know, what I would suggest is making sure these programs you access are reputable. There's Beyond Blue. There's the Macquarie Anxiety Program. We run anxiety programs at the University of Sydney, and there are psychology clinics. And also at the Black Dog Institute. There's also the Raising Children's Network that has information and links. So making sure, firstly, the links are reputable, and we'll go through them all in the strategies in future webinars, but then also getting good information so that you can potentially implement some of those helpful strategies. For some children, they will be expected to return to school for just a few weeks of term 4 and then a long summer break. Do you think in some ways this is harder for kids? That's a really good question, actually.
Well, I just would pick up a minor point. It's an 11-week term and everyone will be back by the beginning of week 6. So every child should have 5 full weeks at school. Yes, they will then go into a summer break, but I think it's so important to get them back. I'm just thrilled that we're going back this year. Don't have,
yeah.
You want to expand on that, Tracy?
Me too, Hugh. Yeah, I'm the same. And I think the friendship aspect is so crucial. Yes, we've got this friendship bubble that's just been introduced this week, but having time to re-establish those connections going into the holidays is going to be really important for many students. You know, some of them will be breaking into newly established friendship groups that have come about as a consequence of some students remaining on site this whole time. And so old friendships, you know, a little bit of tension there perhaps, it will give everybody a chance to be back together, to see their teachers, to celebrate the end of year together and to go off into the holidays, feeling confident about themselves that they did it, they came back to school and nothing too much has terribly changed for students. And as children, and that their friends are still there and people still care, and going into the holidays with that positive attitude and, you know, being ready for the following year, whatever that brings.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research seems to back up both of your statements. The research seems to suggest it's the social isolation and the lack of social skill development because of that isolation that's really impacting kids the most in lots of indirect ways. So, you know, I know that there is a lot of fear, and I think in the next 8 weeks, there's going to be a changing landscape, but there is value in giving kids a shot of confidence and overcoming some of the challenges before starting the new year. So, yeah, I mean, there'll be a continuing discussion about that. And I'm sure the Department of Education will be providing stronger guidance in the coming weeks. In terms of direct strategies at school that kids can use to manage their COVID fears, what are the typical things? This is a question from one of the listeners. What are the direct things kids are doing to manage their COVID fears at school?
Look, I mean, I
think like washing hands, I assume, and a variety of other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Having a sense of control. Sorry, Hugh.
Yeah, no, exactly right.
So doing things within their control gives children a sense of confidence and resilience. So yeah, just, you know, having those conversations about reminding them, you know, washing your hands before you eat, when you go out to play, when you come back in, You know, mask wearing if they're comfortable wearing a mask, coughing into your elbow, sneezing into your elbow, staying home if you're not well. So all of those things that, other than kindergarten, all the students practiced at school last year and actually this year anyway. It's just our new normal hygiene practice. It's been quite good to see. So I think, yeah, focusing on what's within their control and you know, acknowledging that, you know, that they do have a sense of that they have agency and building that confidence and independence.
Okay. Now, this is the last question I have. If I've missed one, the other, I think there was one about kids that are socially isolated. Maybe I've missed it going up. So around that,
I was going to pick that up before with the question about is it worth going back, because you know there are kids and families who haven't engaged a lot.
Yeah.
And, you know, particularly at-risk families, you know, kids who might be in home environments that aren't ideal. I think for those kids in particular, it's so important that we come back to school. And, you know, our learning support teams, our school counselling teams, we're really, really focused on supporting those kids in a range of ways as they come back. You know, so whether that's with providing maybe some additional small group support focused on not just learning, but also their well-being. It might be, you know, programming some specific social skills sort of development programs if we see that there's a need for that. But most of all, just, you know, providing them with that wraparound support that I think public schools do so well through the class teacher, through their friends, and through the whole staff and the whole school community.
Yeah.
Yeah, and remembering that there was pre-COVID, so before this lockdown, the children were doing just fine. So we've been observing them while we work from home and watch them alongside us learning from home, but they are their own unique individuals when they're at school. They have an identity that's separate from their parents, and they do better than we expect.
What I would suggest is around the social anxiety or children that might really struggle to go into social environments for a range of reasons. I think it's an opportunity to problem solve and to think about the friendship bubble and just really start, you know, maybe thinking about how can you use a friendship bubble to start testing out some of the fears for kids. And maybe, you know, I was speaking to my son about some of his fears, and I realised I'm not going to choose one of those friends that just wants to play computer games with him. I'm going to choose a friend that, you know, well, he's going to choose, but he's going to get a friend that's going to interact. So just thinking really about how you might start using the opportunities in the park and at home to start to address some of those concerns. There's one last question before we finish up. If there is hesitancy from parents to send kids back when they are due, do you expect them to keep running homeschooling as well, or will that completely stop? And I think I'll answer that question because there's been a lot of media about that issue. A lot of parents have been petitioning the Department of Education for that voluntary option. But at present, the Department of Education has advised that there won't be that option for homeschooling, and that's something that I guess the principals have to listen to. But I'm sure that it'll be an evolving situation. If those petitions are successful, then maybe there might be other options. But I'm certain that at least for this year, and maybe you can reinforce that there'll be the schools will be as flexible and as accommodating as possible to manage the various issues that might come up.
Yeah, look, that's correct. You know, the department's made very clear that, you know, those return dates, everyone's expected to be back and that schools are safe places to be. The only exception is if there's a sign-off from a doctor. You know, if there's medical reasons why kids can't return to school, if the risk to their health is too great from getting COVID, then there's options to look at distance education. We haven't had a lot of information about how that's going to look at this stage, but yeah, that's certainly been the communication from the department.
And I think it's fair to say that we're still a way off from this happening, and so I think that there'll be more advice, and I think there'll be much more discussion between now and when kids actually start going back to school. So I think that's an evolving situation. But hopefully this today has been helpful and you've gained some ideas. But really, can I just say a big thank you to Tracy and Hugh. They didn't have to do this. It's on their own time. And I really appealed to them because I knew there was a lot of worry, and they wanted to share some of their advice and knowledge. And I think it again speaks to this idea that schools really are becoming community hubs, and dare I say it, heroes for the community in many, many cases. And so thank you very much, Tracy and Hugh, for coming on. And make sure you keep in contact. And please, if you have any questions about this seminar, write to kidsinmind@sydney.edu.au. If you have suggestions on what you'd like to hear, practical strategies. I have academics all across Sydney wanting to contribute and to help families. So we want to get honest, reliable information out there. Now on Monday, we know that there's issues around parents and vaccines and medications. And so we've invited experts to talk about how to manage those issues in relation to when there's disagreement between parents and what the role of children is in sort of deciding around vaccines and medication. It's going to be a tricky discussion, but I think it's an important one to have. Then on Wednesday, we've got an expert talking about the development of health decision-making and extreme beliefs. So what can we do? And I think we all know that some people have, it's been amazing, the diversity in views expressed. So how do we manage that process? In coming weeks, we'll be talking about social development and managing social development in kids and how we can support. And then you can also go onto the website for the Brain and Mind Centre, University of Sydney, to see upcoming webinars that we'll continue to stream. Thank you very much, Tracy and Hugh. Very appreciated. And we'll load up all those resources you gave for families.
Thanks for having us, Adam.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, everyone.